Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies revision video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are revising the ontological argument for the existence of God. So we'll be taking a look at Anselm's original formulation, his first formulation of the argument. We'll then take a look at Gaunilo's criticisms of this before considering Anselm's second formulation, which he developed in response to those criticisms from Gaunilo. We'll then be taking a look at a more contemporary version of the ontological argument developed by Descartes, and then Kant's criticisms of this, before we conclude by looking at the overall strengths and weaknesses of ontological arguments. So let's get started with a quick look at the OCR specification, which sets out everything you need to know and that you could be asked about on this topic. And just as a quick note, if you are revising for AQA, everything in this video will be relevant for you as well. So please don't worry that we're looking here at the OCR spec, but this specification is actually really helpful because it sets out, as I say, the key knowledge we need to know, but also the key questions we need to start considering. So we need to start thinking about whether a posteriori or a priori arguments are the more persuasive style of argument. We need to think about whether or not existence can be treated as a predicate, and Immanuel Kant believed it could not be. We need to consider whether or not the ontological argument justifies belief in God, and whether or not there are logical fallacies in this argument that cannot be overcome. So those questions will be a real focus point for us today as we talk through the key AO1 and AO2 that we need to know about the ontological argument. So let's meet the key scholars that we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking mainly about St. Anselm here, who developed the original ontological argument. We'll then be talking about Gaunilo, who criticised him. And it's really important to note that Gaunilo was also a monk like Anselm. So even though Gaunilo did believe in God, he didn't think the ontological argument was a successful way of proving God's existence. And he uses his perfect island example to critique and challenge the structure of Anselm's ontological argument. We'll then also go back to Anselm for his second formulation of his ontological argument, which he developed in response to Gaunilo. And that's where he starts talking about the difference between contingent and necessary beings. But more on all that to come today. We will then also look at a more contemporary version of an ontological argument developed by this man here, the third picture, which is, of course, René Descartes. And he talks about triangles, he talks about mountains, and he talks about God as the supremely perfect being. And then finally, we'll be talking about Immanuel Kant, someone that we're very familiar with from the ethics section of the course, aren't we? And he criticized Descartes' version of the ontological argument. So they are our key scholars for today, and it is really important, in order to secure that A star, that every paragraph you are writing refers to a scholar. Make sure that you really ground your arguments in the scholars and what they have said. So let's start now with a quick look at the difference between a priori and a posteriori arguments. And hopefully you remember from the specification, we need to start thinking about which style are more persuasive. So on the course, we look at three different arguments for the existence of God. We look at the ontological argument, which we're looking at today, and that is our a priori argument. But we also look at the teleological argument, also known as the design argument, and the cosmological argument, also known as the first cause argument. And those two, the teleological and cosmological arguments, are a posteriori arguments. So we need to compare the ontological argument with the teleological and cosmological arguments. And our key comparison here is whether a priori or a posteriori arguments are more persuasive. So what actually are they? Well, let's start with a priori arguments. And the clue is in the name, really, because an a priori argument is one that is made prior to experience. So with an a priori argument, you are not using your empirical evidence, you are not using sensory experience. It is an argument that is made independent to experience. So it's based on reason, logic, and thinking alone. And as I've put here, it concerns facts that are known before experience. And of course, our great example here is mathematics. But we can also refer to tautologies, things that are true by definition, such as that a triangle has 3 angles, because the word itself contains the answer, doesn't it? Because triangle means 3 angles. So a priori arguments are about deduction from pure reason. So with an a priori argument, you are making your argument, you are reaching your conclusions prior to any empirical evidence whatsoever. So of course, someone like Plato, who believed we can't trust our senses, would be really happy about this style of argument. And a priori arguments are deductive arguments, and they lead to certainty. So we can say that they are watertight because you are not relying on the unreliability of your empirical evidence, because you're not using empirical evidence. So with a priori arguments, they are deductive arguments and they lead to certainty. And that is because, and this is really important, if the premises of the argument are correct, then the conclusion the argument reaches is guaranteed to be correct as well. So if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be correct. And this is really important when we talk about the ontological argument, because the argument depends on Anselm's definition of God. So one of the criticisms that we'll make of Anselm is that, yes, okay, your ontological argument might work if your definition of God is correct, but it all depends on whether somebody accepts and believes in that definition of God. So when we talk about whether this argument can prove the existence of God, we'll be asking, well, can you prove the existence of anything at all prior to sense experience? Or do you actually need empirical evidence, which of course a priori arguments do not use? And remember, it depends on the premises of the argument being correct in order for that conclusion to be correct as well. And of course, our key criticism is going to be Anselm assumes everyone shares his definition of God, which is just not the case. But just as an example of an a priori argument, we've got that statement there that a triangle has 3 angles, and that is what we call a tautology. It's something true by definition. I don't actually need to go and check whether a triangle has 3 angles, although of course I could go and do that if I wanted to, because I know from the word itself that it is correct, because triangle, if we break that word down, literally means 3 angles. If we then take a look at our a posteriori arguments, these are, unlike a priori arguments, arguments that do use empirical evidence. They do rely on our sensory experience, because they are arguments that are made and conclusions that are reached after experience, or if we focus on the word itself, post experience. So it's a little bit like with the post-mortem, which is when they investigate the body after death. A posteriori argument is one that is made after experience. So you use your senses, you use the empirical method, and then you reach your conclusion. So again, as I've put here, an a posteriori argument uses knowledge gained through experience. So it uses the empirical method, using sensory experience and observation to gain knowledge about the world. And of course, we see that, don't we, with the teleological argument, because it's based on the evidence of design. We again see that with the cosmological argument, because it's based on that observation of motion and causation. It's an argument, an a posteriori argument, that uses empirical facts to then make inferences about what is true. And this is really important. A posteriori arguments are inductive arguments. That means that they lead to probability, because we can't be 100% sure that our observations and that our empirical evidence are absolutely correct. So the conclusions have probability. And of course, that is a clear contrast with a priori arguments, which lead to certainty. So there is a key comparison point for you that you could talk about in terms of whether a priori or a posteriori are better, because you can say that whilst a priori lead to certainty, a posteriori only lead to probability. But then, of course, in response to that, you could say that the strength of an a posteriori argument is that it does use empirical evidence, which in the modern world today, people really value. You could say we live in an age of epistemic imperialism for science. If you think about the scientific method, which is the most popular method of acquiring knowledge and understanding today, it is grounded in that empirical method. And so we can see there from the statement, it is raining now, that a posteriori arguments are made post-experience. You need to go and check whether it is raining, and then you can reach that conclusion. So remember that it is the teleological argument and the cosmological argument that are a posteriori arguments. So if we just take a step back, what you need to think about is which type of argument is better, which is more persuasive, which one do you think is more convincing? And of course, you need to consider the strengths and the weaknesses of each type. But yeah, just really important to know that an a priori argument, which is what the ontological argument is one that is made before experience. You do not rely on the empirical method. It is based on pure reason, logic, and thought alone. And a priori arguments are deductive, which means that they lead to certainty, because if the premises are correct, then that conclusion is guaranteed to be correct as well. So let's have a look at our a priori argument for the existence of God, which is the ontological argument. And I thought we could just start with a few headline bullet points. I absolutely love a bullet point for simplifying your revision. And let's have a look at what this argument actually claims. So the first thing to know is it claims that the proposition God exists is a priori and deductive. And so that means that the idea God exists can be known to be true without reference to sense experience. So just by thinking about God's nature and thinking about the definition of God, you can actually, this argument claims, have absolute certainty that God necessarily exists. And of course, this is going to be really important for your AO2 as to whether you can actually prove the existence of God or you can know the existence of God a priori. Surely you could make an argument, we need empirical evidence before we believe something actually exists. The second bullet point is that the definition of God, and Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, means that God must exist both in the understanding and in reality. Because if God only existed in the understanding, then there could be an even greater being who does possess existence as well. So Anselm is going to argue that the definition of God necessitates his existence, not just in the understanding, but also in reality. But it is really important you know that that is Anselm's definition of God, and he assumes that everybody shares that definition of God as well, which hopefully you're already thinking about your AO2 is going to be a great thing to criticize about his ontological argument. And then a third bullet point, which comes in when we talk about his second formulation, is that God's existence is a necessary truth, not a contingent one. So more on that, as I say, when we talk about Gallileo's criticisms and then Anselm's response to that. Let's start by talking about Anselm then, shall we? It is really important that, as I say, we refer to scholars in our answers. And I think that is particularly the case with the ontological argument, because when you are writing about the ontological argument, you obviously want to talk about the argument, but then you also want to talk about Anselm, because it's really important we understand him, we understand who he was, in order to understand his ontological argument, because Anselm was born in 1033 and he died in 1109. He was a Benedictine monk, theologian, and philosopher. And in terms of your knowledge about Anselm, this is the most important thing to know, that he was a monk. Excuse me, guys, whilst I just find the little highlighter feature. Here it is. He was a Benedictine monk. So he was somebody who was immersed. Please do excuse that terrible highlighting, by the way. What can I say? There's no excuses for how bad that is. I mean, I will try and correct it, but I'll probably make it look even worse. There we go. Okay, that's a bit better if I just colour that in there. There we go. But we get the point, I hope, that he was a Benedictine monk and that that is a really important thing to know and write about in your answer, because that tells us that he already believed in God. He was immersed in what Wittgenstein would say is the Christian language game. So he is not here as some neutral philosopher. He is very much already immersed in that theistic language game. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury up until his death. And I think, again, that is very important. He was so committed to his faith that he became a leader within the Christian religion. Another important thing to know is his definition of God. He defined God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if he was writing the dictionary, although he wouldn't have much time because he was, of course, Archbishop of Canterbury, he would have defined God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And that is absolutely at the core of his argument. And this, as I mentioned, is going to be something we can criticize, because Aquinas, for example, said that we can't actually know the nature of God because of the fallenness and the fallibility of our human minds. And we can also say that Anselm's argument depends on this definition. And so if somebody doesn't share that definition of God with him, then the whole argument falls apart. And we could see that as a logical fallacy. Another really great reference to make in your answer is to his mission statement. This was his motto in life, and it was credo ut intelligam in Latin, which means I believe in order to understand, or that belief precedes understanding. And that's really important as well, because Anselm originally wrote his argument as a prayer. So he wasn't of the opinion that you need proof in order to then believe something. He actually thought that faith must come first. And so we can see the ontological argument as his way of confirming his belief in God logically, rather than trying to prove the existence of God. And we'll talk about that more today. Let's talk now, though, about his ontological argument, and we're going to start with the first formulation. Remember, there are two formulations to his argument. The first one, which we're going to talk through now, is the original version. We then have his second formulation, and he developed that in response to Gaunilo's criticisms of him. So we're going to start with the first formulation. We'll then talk about Gaunilo's criticisms of that, and then we'll look at his second formulation, which was in direct response to Gaunilo's criticisms. And the starting point for this first formulation is from the Bible, from the Psalms, as you would expect from a Benedictine monk and Archbishop of Canterbury. And he refers to a line from the Psalms which says, "The fool says in his heart that there is no God." And the fool here we can take to be the atheist. So someone who doesn't believe in God. And Anselm really does sort of jump upon this, and he uses this as the foundation for his first formulation, because he believes that this shows every single person, including an atheist, knows or has an idea of God. And that's really important for him, because he believes, as we know, that the definition of God is as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, in other words, God is the greatest possible being. And Anselm asserts that the atheist understands this just as much as the theist. And as I say, this comes down to the Psalms, which says, "The fool says in his heart that there is no God." And Anselm says, well, that means that they know what God is, that they can imagine God, they can think of God, they can conceive of God in their mind, because you can't deny something, you can't reject something that you don't have an idea of. And he thinks he's being quite clever here. Interesting to know what you think in the comments, because he asserts that, well, the atheist understands that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, just as much as the theist. So he says the atheist, just as much as the theist, thinks of God as the greatest possible being. So he said, therefore, everyone has an idea of God, meaning God exists in everyone's mind. So this is really important. And I suppose, yeah, we can get on board with this to an extent, the idea that everyone can think of God. But of course, a key criticism we can make is that not everybody thinks of God in the same way. Anselm is assuming here that everybody thinks of God as the greatest possible being. Now, if we think about Richard Dawkins, for example, our key atheist critic, he would not share that definition of God. He actually said that the God of the Old Testament is the cruelest character in all of fiction. So Dawkins would not share that definition of God. But let's just bear with Anselm for a moment. He says that God exists in everyone's mind. And this is where he tries to be quite clever, because he says, but hang on, the definition of God is that he is the greatest possible being. And so he says, listen, it is greater to exist in reality rather than just in the mind. Which means, and this is, as I say, where he tries to be clever, let me know what you think in the comments, Everybody who understands God knows that he can't just exist in the mind alone, because then there could be an even greater being. And so it would be a contradiction of the definition. So he says, by definition, God must exist not only in the mind, but also in reality. So this is Anselm saying that if you can think of God and you can conceive of God as the greatest possible being, then that necessitates his existence in reality. Because if God only existed in the mind as an idea, then he wouldn't be the greatest possible being, because there could be an even greater being who also possesses existence. And we'll talk about this a lot more actually when we talk about Descartes' version. And he describes God as a supremely perfect being, which means he must possess existence, because otherwise he would not be perfect. But Anselm is trying to use the idea of God, and in particular the definition of God, to say that, listen, you don't even need any empirical evidence. Logically, you have to know that if you can think of God as the greatest possible being, then you must believe, you must know that he exists in reality, because otherwise that definition would be a contradiction. So lots of language games being played here, aren't there? But if we just look at that final line, that's really important to take away. He's saying that, so by definition, God must necessarily exist both in the mind and in reality. What do we think of this then? Well, I want to just break it down for you into 4 stages to make it really clear in your mind. And then as part of your revision, you can really consolidate this into your memory so you can then write about it in the exam. So if we just break it down into 4 stages now, let's simplify. Point number 1 is that by definition, God is a being greater than which nothing greater can be conceived. Point number 2, everyone can conceive of God in their mind, even the fool, even the atheist. Point number 3, it is greater to exist than not to exist. Point number 4, therefore God must exist both in the mind and in reality. Otherwise, there would be an even greater being. So there we go, job done. Anselm has a priori proven the existence of God, or has he? A few things to pick out here, I think. The first one is about that first point, the first stage, that there is an assumption here that everybody shares this definition and that this is the correct definition of God. We have then also got, if we move to the 4th point there, an assumption again being made that you can prove something actually exists without any empirical evidence whatsoever, that you can believe that God must exist in reality without having any empirical proof for that. Now, as I mentioned, Aquinas would disagree with that. Our a posteriori arguments actually do try to use empirical evidence instead. So you've got to think, is this persuasive when it's based on reasoning and logic alone? And of course, when it depends on that definition of God. So lots to sort of start unpacking now, but please do let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on this first formulation? Are you convinced? Has Anselm proven a priori that God must necessarily exist? Because otherwise there would be a contradiction in that definition. And as I say, it really does all depend, doesn't it, on that definition of God that he gives. Let's have a look at the ideas of someone who was not persuaded and who was not convinced at all by Anselm's argument, and that is Gaunilo. Now, it's really important to note that he was a monk. Let me highlight the word monk again, really important term for us today, because the fact that Gaunilo was a monk, so again, he was immersed within that theistic language game and he was deeply committed to his faith, but he didn't like this argument, hopefully illustrates to us that there are many problems with it, that even a theist would not be convinced by this argument. And he wrote a text called On Behalf of the Fool. So again, referring to the Psalms, which is the starting point for Anselm's ontological argument. And he wanted to show through his writing that understanding that definition of God does not necessarily mean God exists. So he's saying somebody can understand that definition of God, they can imagine that definition of God, they can conceive of that definition of God. But that does not then mean God must exist in reality as well. And he uses his really brilliant, actually perfect island example to illustrate this. He takes the structure of Anselm's argument, but he replaces God as the greatest possible being with an island as the greatest possible island. And he then demonstrates that you can conceive of that greatest possible island in your mind, but that doesn't then mean the island actually exists in reality. So let's talk through his argument, shall we, in his criticism of Anselm here. And the key point that I've underlined, which I hope shows you how important it is that you cannot define God into existence. So you can imagine or understand the concept of God in your mind as the greatest possible being, as Anselm says, but this doesn't mean that God therefore must actually exist. So we can't then leap to arguing that God has to exist in reality. You cannot define God into existence. And as I say, he uses his perfect island example to illustrate this. So let's talk through it now. I want you to imagine the greatest conceivable, most perfect island somewhere in the ocean. So, close your eyes and imagine what is going to be on your island. Have you got sunshine, or is it going to be snow covered? Have you got a McDonald's there? What have you got on your perfect island? Have you got a swimming pool, racetrack, big house, lots of animals? Imagine the greatest conceivable, most perfect island. And let's imagine it's somewhere in the ocean. For me, it's going to be in the Caribbean. It's going to be in the Mediterranean Ocean because I want it to be 35 degrees, please. And I want there to be a nice beach for me to sit on and read my book. And obviously there needs to be a lot of green tea in the store cupboard over there as well. So he says, imagine that this island, so your island that you're imagining now with all of those amazing features on it, is the greatest possible island, which is that than which no greater islands can be conceived. So can you see what he's done here? He's taken Anselm's argument, he's taken the structure of the argument, but he's replaced God with island to illustrate the problems with the structure of this a priori argument. And then he turns around and he shatters our dreams because we're imagining our island and we're thinking, well, based on Anselm's logic, this island must actually exist. It must be out there. So I'm thinking, right, get me to Manchester Airport now. Let's get a plane and fly out there to my perfect island in the Mediterranean where I can sit on the beach and drink my green tea. He says, just because you can imagine this island as the greatest possible island in your mind, and we can all do it because we've all just done it, that does not prove it actually exists in reality as well. As I say, devastating news, very unfortunately. Sorry to tell you that. He says, you cannot just think your perfect island into existence. You need to have empirical evidence to actually prove it. So Garnilo is showing here that there is a big gap, a massive gap between something existing in your mind and then actually existing in reality. He says the island's existence, other than in your mind, as we've said, has not actually been proven by this argument because there is no actual evidence of the island. It exists in your imagination. We can agree with that, but this does not mean it necessarily exists in reality. Just by saying that it is the greatest possible island, that doesn't mean we go, oh, well, it must definitely exist then. Where is it on the map? And you're going to look on the map, and obviously, sadly, it's not actually there, is it? So he is making a point here that Anselm is using words, he's using language to try and define something into existence. And you can't do that because you need to have empirical evidence for it. And just another point that I think is really important as well, actually, in terms of criticising the structure of this argument, is that everyone's island would be different, wouldn't it? As I say, I'm imagining on my island that it's going to be really hot and sunny. There's going to be, I want an M&S. I want a Sainsbury's. We want a nice bookshop. I'm imagining my island. That could be someone else's idea of hell. They might want it to be igloos. They might want it to be the North Pole. They might want it to be covered in, I don't know, football pitches, which is my idea of hell. I would be jumping off the island. So you've got to think this idea of you imagining something is very subjective. So, of course, if Anselm's getting people to say, well, God exists in your mind, you've got to say, well, does that then mean he's saying there are 7 billion, 8 billion different gods that must exist in reality? Because everybody's going to have a slightly different understanding of their island in this case and what's on their island. And then when we apply it to God, everyone's going to think of God in a slightly different way as well, aren't they? So we've got lots of problems here with the structure of the argument, but the main point here is you cannot define God into existence. Just by thinking of God as the greatest possible being, that doesn't mean he necessarily exists in reality. That doesn't prove he exists in reality any more than thinking of your greatest possible island means that that island must necessarily exist somewhere out there in the ocean. As I say, very unfortunately, sorry to break that news to you today. Now, Anselm heard of this. He got a copy of the book, and it's fair to say he was not happy. He hit back. He started some drama with Gaunilo because he came up with his second version with the ontological argument 2.0, which was a response, it was a rebuttal to Gaunilo's criticism. And we know this as his second formulation because it is his response to Gaunilo, and he's seeking here to clarify, he's seeking here to resolve, and ultimately he's seeking to defend his argument for the existence of God. So let's see if he manages to adequately refute Gaunilo's criticisms. He says that Gaunilo is mistaken because he cannot just replace God with an island in the structure of that argument, because God is a special case. So he says you cannot compare God to an island. So the argument only works for God because God is a special case. And that is because, he says, islands are contingent, whereas God is necessary. And we're going to unpack these key terms now. He says that beings you can imagine not existing are called contingent beings. They are called contingent because they depend on something else for their existence. That should say, please do excuse my terrible grammar there. So contingent, the way I always remember this, is a contingency plan is one that you follow if something else happens. So you have a contingency plan for if there is a fire, for example. So you don't follow that contingency plan all the time. You only follow it if the fire actually happens. So it is conditional, isn't it? So a contingent being is something that depends on something else for its existence. So it can't just be there. It has to have been created. It has to have, come from somewhere. It's dependent on something else, much like the contingency plan is only followed if something else has already happened. He says that that is what an island is. An island is a contingent being. So we can imagine it not existing because we know that islands don't just appear. They've not always been there. They have to have been created. Now, I'm not a geography expert. I did do GCSE geography, but we did more on the Trafford Centre than how islands are formed. So please do bear with me in not being able to explain to you how islands are actually created. I'm sure someone will in the comments below, though. I'm sure someone is a geography expert and they've just come back from the field trip and they're going to tell us now all about islands. So he is saying that an island is a contingent being. He says, in contrast to that, there are beings that cannot not exist, and they are called necessary beings. And he says, well, necessary beings are better than contingent beings. And so, just think of where he's going here. If God were a contingent being, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being, because if God was a contingent being, he would be dependent on something or even someone else for his existence. And he says, well, that means he wouldn't be the greatest possible being because there would be an even greater one that created him. And so God can't be a contingent being because, again, that would go against the definition of God. So he rejects that idea. He says God cannot be a contingent being because then he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. So again, he's bringing it back to his definition of God. He says that God's definition means he must be a necessary being because his definition, as we've said, is the greatest possible being. So he says God is a necessary being, unlike the island. God is a necessary being, which he must be, again, based on the definition of God. And that means God cannot not exist. So by definition, he does exist. So the key takeaway here from this second formulation, which again is very much dependent on and built upon Anselm's definition of God, is that God is a necessary being, which means he necessarily exists. And then his response to Gaunilo's criticism is that you can't replace God with an island in the argument because islands are contingent, whereas God is necessary. So you can't compare God to an island. So my question to you would be, has Anselm succeeded here in adequately refuting Gaunilo's challenge? Well, Let's ask that question now, shall we? Please let me know what you think in the comments. You could argue, well, no, he hasn't, because you cannot define God into existence. Simply saying that God exists doesn't mean that he does. People need more evidence and proof. Again, we could say a posteriori arguments are more convincing because although they only lead to probability, at least they do use empirical evidence, which is more convincing. That's what people value, especially in the world today. We could also say that his argument still doesn't work because we do not have a common understanding of God. It depends upon his definition of God. And you could say that that is a matter of faith. There's actually no proof that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. There is no proof that God is the greatest possible being. Somebody believing that is a matter of faith rather than fact. And you could say, well, that works for Anselm, because remember, he said that belief precedes understanding. So he believes you do just need to have faith in that definition of God. But, you know, the point is not everybody does have faith in that definition of God. Not everybody does share that definition of God. You could even say that even amongst a theist community, so even within that theistic language game, that phrase, greatest possible being, does actually mean different things to different people. In the same way that everybody has a different idea of their perfect island, everybody has a different idea of God. Furthermore, we can imagine plenty of greatest things in our minds, can't we? It doesn't mean that they are real, and it doesn't mean that we are right. So we've got a lot of problems here with this gap, and we can see it as a logical fallacy between what people can conceive of and what then actually exists in reality, that big gap between in the mind and in reality. We can say he's making too big of a leap in logic to assume that just because you've proven something in your mind, that necessitates its existence in reality. And of course, as we said there, you know, does this not actually undermine monotheism? Because everyone's going to have a slightly different understanding of God in their minds. And so that means that we're defining 8 billion different versions of God into existence, in the same way that we'd end up with 8 billion different perfect islands, and then there'd be no room in the oceans left. We could also, and I love this example actually, use the example of gossip, because there is a really great point here that we can imagine the people being discussed when we are hearing gossip, but it doesn't mean that what we're being told is actually true. So this shows us again that significant difference between what we can have as an idea and we can imagine and we can conceive of in our minds, but then what's actually true, what actually exists in reality. So think about it. You know, you've read an article about someone like Kim Kardashian or, I don't know, Cristiano Ronaldo. You can read that article about them. You can imagine them in your head doing it. You can think, yeah, I can imagine her going there. I can imagine him going on holiday there. I can imagine that happening. But that doesn't actually mean they've done it. So there is a big gap, there's a big difference between what you can imagine in your mind, what you can conceive of in your mind, and what's actually true. So just because you can think it, it doesn't mean it's actually true. We can imagine God existing as the greatest possible being, but that doesn't mean he actually does. So I think that's a great concrete example. And remember, examples are brilliant for securing your A star in your exam answers. And then one final point. We are all fully aware of our own existence, aren't we? But we can also imagine our non-existence. We can doubt our existence. We can say, well, you know, I am aware that I will one day die. So in the same way we're aware that we are alive now, we can conceive of the fact, we can imagine the fact that one day the world will continue turning without us in it. So we could say, why should it not be the same for God? We can imagine God's non-existence just as much as we can imagine God's existence. God does not necessarily exist just because we can think about him as existing. You need to go further than just saying, well, the definition of God means that he definitely exists. You need to go further in terms of providing your empirical proof. So, you know, we can reject the concept of God. So you know how Anselm was saying that even the fool knows God. They have that idea of God. You could say, well, yes, they do, and they then reject that idea. The fact that they know this idea of God doesn't mean they then have to believe he actually exists. So actually, the argument is flawed. So just have a think about those bullet points. Think about which one for you is the best example of an AO2 critical analysis point, and then think of your own as well. Do you think that Anselm has successfully refuted Gaunilo or not? Would be great to hear what you think in the comments below. But what we are going to do now is we're actually going to look at some support for Anselm, and we're going to talk about Descartes, who develops a more contemporary version of the ontological argument. Now, for Descartes, he doesn't use the same definition of God. Remember, Anselm's definition, which is central to his argument, is that God is the greatest possible being. Descartes instead uses the idea of God being the supremely perfect being. So let me have a go at highlighting that word. So when you talk about Anselm, you're talking about the greatest, whereas with Descartes, you're talking about him being perfect. But again, Descartes' definition is central to his ontological argument. And let's talk through that argument now. So the first premise that he makes, and the first point that he makes, is I have the idea of God. Number two, God is a supremely perfect being. So again, Descartes is assuming here everybody is going to share his definition of God. He says that existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist. So he says the fact that God is a supremely perfect being means that God must exist, because if God didn't exist, then he wouldn't be a supremely perfect being, and so the definition would be a contradiction, the definition would be wrong. So again, you can see just how dependent this argument is on the definition. And again, it's back to that point that if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be correct. It's guaranteed to be true. But again, we can come back to our criticism that the idea God is a supremely perfect being is something people have to believe as a matter of faith rather than fact. It is not something that everybody believes, whereas Descartes is assuming everybody does. He believes that existence is central to the essence of God. And what we mean by that is that it's central to his identity. It's central to who he is. And he has this absolutely brilliant quote that I absolutely love, that really encapsulates this idea that existence is central to the essence of God. So I want to read this quote for you now, because it is such a brilliant piece of evidence for you to refer to. He said, it is quite evident, so he's very confident, he's very certain, that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that its three angles, sorry, I've spelt that wrong. That's really terrible. Let me just get a red pen and cross that out, because that is terrible. It should, of course, say there, 3, the number 3. There we go. I've drawn it in yellow, which means you can't see it, but I hope you get the point. Please excuse me. So it's meant to say the fact that its 3 angles equal 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain that can be separated from the idea of a valley. So what is he saying here? Well, very, very simply, he's saying that in the same way that you cannot have a mountain without a valley, and you cannot have a triangle without 3 angles, you cannot have God without existence. So you cannot separate God from existence any more than you can separate a mountain from a valley, any more than you can say that a triangle doesn't have 3 angles. So that is how central existence is to God's essence. So he talks about existence being central to God's essence, in the same way that a triangle must have 3 angles, and in the same way that you can't separate a mountain from a valley. And that is because God is a supremely perfect being and existence is a perfection. So again, what do we think of this argument? Is this convincing? Do you think this is better than Anselm's version, or does it make the same mistakes and have the same structural flaws? Just to go into a bit more detail for you, I've got a few bullet points here. As you know, we love a bullet point. Descartes says that God is by definition perfect. He says an imperfect God would not be perfect. So if God is perfect, he must contain all perfections, and that includes the perfection of existence. So if God did not exist, he would not be perfect. So that means he must exist. So a very simple point that he's making here, but obviously it's not quite that straightforward, is it? But for Descartes, he's saying that God's definition is that he is a supremely perfect being, which means he must possess all perfections, which means he must exist, because if he did not exist, he would not be perfect. And he says that existence, and this is a really key phrase actually, that I'm going to highlight, or I should say attempt to highlight, although we know my track record on this now. So he says existence is a defining predicate of the concept of God. in the same way that having three sides and three angles is necessary to the concept of a triangle, because by definition, a triangle has three angles. So in the same way that by definition, a triangle has three angles, he says that by definition, God has existence. So two great examples again that we can use there in our answers. We can talk about a triangle, we can talk about a mountain and a valley, we can then talk about God and existence. So what do you think? Is he successful here in proving, again, a priori, that God must necessarily exist because it is central to his essence? Well, someone who was not convinced at all was Immanuel Kant. He was very critical of ontological arguments, and we're going to find out why. His first criticism, he makes two. His first one is that Descartes' argument uses flawed logic. So he's actually criticizing here the structure of the argument. And again, I think this is really important when we're talking about logical fallacies and when we are talking about the problems with the arguments. We're talking here about the framework of the argument. We're saying that the argument actually fails because of the way it's been put together, because of the assumptions it makes, because of the fallacies and flaws that it contains. So this is about the structure of the arguments and the fact that it's actually flawed. Let's see what he says. He said, if you accept that there is a God, it is logical to accept also that his existence is necessary. But he says you don't have to accept that there is a God in the first place. He says the triangle, so remember we spoke about the triangle, he says the triangle only has three angles if the triangle exists in the first place. And the key word there that's doing all the heavy lifting, so I'm going to highlight it, is the word if. He says that if God exists, and again, let me highlight the word, then God exists necessarily. But if God does not exist, then he does not necessarily exist. So the key word is if. And again, it's down to that question of you can imagine something, you can conceive of something in your mind, but that doesn't then necessitate its actual existence. So it's a hypothetical, isn't it, here? And, you know, that's quite an ironic link because, of course, Kant talks about hypothetical and categorical imperatives as part of his ethical theory. So his argument here is that you can understand Descartes' definition without it being true. You can understand God as the supremely perfect being and then reject belief in him and reject belief in that. So there is a significant difference, and we've spoken about this quite a lot today, between conceiving of something in the mind and then something existing in reality. So he is arguing that ontological arguments are bad logic because they make us suppose that if we justify God's perfection as including existence, we must believe that God exists. And he says that's simply not the case. We can conceive of this idea, but there is a big word to add here, and it's if. It's that if God exists, his existence is necessary, or God exists necessarily, I should say. But the big word there is if, because you can understand that definition, you can conceive of that idea of God without it actually being true. His second criticism then is about using existence as a predicate. Remember, Descartes says that existence is a defining predicate of God, that existence is central to the essence of God in the same way that a mountain must have a valley and that a triangle must have three angles. He said that existence is not actually a predicate at all. It adds nothing to our understanding of a concept to say that it exists. You cannot say that something exists because it possesses existence. You need to say something more. And he uses the example of coins, of 100 thalers as they were in his time. And he said predicates of this are that the coins are gold, they're metallic, they're round, they contain an image of the king. And he says, if you then say, well, the thalers exist, that adds actually nothing. It adds absolutely nothing. And it does not prove that they do actually exist. Your proof that they exist comes from experiencing them, doesn't it? It's about having those coins in your hand and seeing that they're gold, metallic, they're round. And when you have them in your hand and you can see those predicates for yourself, you can say, okay, the thalers do exist because I've got them in my hand, so I've got empirical evidence for them, and they've got all the predicates that a thaler should have. So he said the only way to prove that they exist is to experience the predicates via our senses. This would then prove that they are real. So again, you could imagine those coins in your mind, but that doesn't mean that they must therefore exist in reality. Unfortunately, much like with the island, you can't define the money into existence. You know, or otherwise we'd all be doing it, wouldn't we? We'd just sit at home going, I'm imagining the greatest possible amount of £1 million doesn't mean it's then suddenly going to appear on the table in front of me. So his argument again is that saying something exists doesn't mean it does. So again, it's a problem with words, isn't it? It's a problem with the use of language within these arguments. And Bertrand Russell, actually, a very contemporary philosopher, a 20th century philosopher, gave this example of a syllogism. He said that premise 1, men exist. Premise 2, Father Christmas is a man. Premise 3, therefore, Father Christmas exists. Again, it's saying that just by saying that something or someone exists, that doesn't mean they do. It's that question again, it's that problem again of defining something into existence. So you cannot use existence as a defining predicate to say that that proves something exists. You need something more, and you actually need empirical evidence for it. You cannot just define God into existence any more than, unfortunately, you can define your perfect island or coins into existence. So yeah, they are Kant's two criticisms. Again, do you think that they are successful? Do they demonstrate the problems with ontological arguments? Or do you think that actually these a priori arguments put forward by Anselm and Descartes, which are very much dependent on definitions and they're very much immersed within the theistic language game, can actually prove the existence of God? Well, that's the question we're going to ask now, because we're going to take a step back and look at our AO2 evaluation points. So we're going to look at the strengths of ontological arguments and also then the weaknesses, the problems as well. Let's start with the strengths, shall we? We can say that a strength of an a priori argument is that if you accept the premise, then the conclusion must be true as it is logically necessary. And again, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the weaknesses. We know that Anselm's argument and Descartes' argument depend on their definitions. So if you accept, if you believe that definition is correct, then yes, the conclusion is going to convince you. Because if you do believe that God is the greatest possible being, if you do believe that God is a supremely perfect being, then the conclusion that God must therefore exist would work, wouldn't it? So we can see with these a priori arguments that they are watertight, in that they are deductive, that if the premises are correct, then the conclusion is correct as well. But of course, our critical analysis here is that believing that premise, believing that definition, is a matter of belief. That requires faith. And of course, for Anselm, that's fine because faith comes first. But for the majority of people, they're therefore not going to be convinced, because the argument depends on accepting his definition of God as a matter of faith. We could say then, to develop that the argument does work for a theist who shares Anselm's definition of God. So let's acknowledge that for someone who does believe in Anselm's definition of God, this argument actually helps them in terms of providing a philosophically convincing confirmation of their faith. We could say, you know, for somebody who shares his definition of God, it then confirms their faith in God. So it's a way for them to logically demonstrate, we could say, the belief that they have, because they believe in this definition of God, and that then leads to their conclusion, God does actually exist. You could say that Anselm's response to Gaunilo may actually be satisfactory for some theists. They might agree that, no, you cannot compare God to an island because he is a special case. You could say that for some theists, that distinction between contingent and necessary beings makes sense. So you could say a strength of the argument is that his second formulation does adequately refute the challenge put forward by Gaunilo, because he is right to say God is a special case. You cannot compare God to an island. Some people could be more convinced by that. They could believe, yeah, absolutely, you are correct, Anselm. And then finally, for our strengths, you could say that Descartes' more contemporary version may be logically satisfying for some theists. And that's because the argument is deductive and analytic. So it does not rely on empirical evidence. So you could say they find it logically satisfying, and it is a confirmation of their belief in God. If we look at the weaknesses, though, let's have a look at the problems and the criticisms. We could say that a limitation of an a priori argument, such as this one, is that if one premise is shown to be inaccurate, the whole argument fails. And of course, this all comes down to that definition of God, doesn't it? So if you don't believe that definition of God, and that's going to have to be as a matter of faith, then the whole argument is going to fail for you. So, you know, it's quite, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's quite precarious, could we say, to build an entire argument around this definition, because if someone doesn't believe that definition, the rest of the argument is going to be meaningless to them. You could say it only works for those people who accept Anselm's definition of God within his theistic language game. Remember that for Anselm, faith must come first. So this argument is limited to those who already believe not only in God, but in Anselm's definition of God. So, it's really quite niche, we could say, in terms of his target audience here, because it's only people who already believe in God and believe that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, who are going to find this argument satisfactory for them. Because, of course, remember, even theists do reject the argument. Gaunilo, a monk, rejected the argument. He said, you cannot define an island into existence, and therefore you cannot define God into existence either. The structure of the argument is actually flawed, and he illustrated that, didn't he, by replacing God with island. St. Thomas Aquinas, who we know very well from the course, said it is impossible to understand the essence of God. So actually we can't build an argument around the definition of God, around the essence of God. Remember, that's the word that Descartes used, because we can't know that. Our human minds are fallible, they're limited. A little bit like with Aquinas and natural moral law, when he says that the eternal law is in the mind of God, and that's beyond our grasp and understanding. The definition of God is beyond our grasp and understanding. We could also use Kant, of course, as a weakness. He said that ontological arguments use flawed logic, and you can talk about logical fallacies there. And also he said existence is not a predicate. You can't say that, God exists because God exists. It's just a flawed argument to make. And then finally, I think a really great A-star criticism to make is the argument about epistemic imperialism, that in the modern world, people want empirical evidence before they believe something. They are not going to like an argument that is based on logic, reason, and thought alone, and it attempts to define God into existence. People want evidence. They want that empirical evidence. So this argument would not be appealing for them. So thank you very much for joining me. I do hope that's been helpful. Let me know any questions you have, and also let me know your thoughts on this argument. Good luck with your studies and have a great day. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.